Good evening. It's always a pleasure to stand before you, and I hope and pray that as we go through this lesson this evening that you find something in it that you find meaningful and can apply it to your life in some way to make you better in the sight of God. A couple of disclaimers. I need to, have another conversation with the scheduler because I believe this is the third year in a row that I've been scheduled on Super Bowl Sunday. So hopefully this will be okay, but I've noticed that as I go through my sermons and I see the dates, and it's right around this time of year. So let's begin. I want to thank Landon for those songs. Many of you asked me, hey, what are you talking about tonight? And initially I had an idea and I shared it, but then the more I think about it, it is a lesson I think about grace. But I want to start it in a little different fashion. And as I told Kelsey this afternoon, I found a way to link it into school. Some of you may not know who this man is. This is Dale Hummer. Dale is probably best known in DeKalb County for being the football coach at DeKalb High School in 1986 when we won the Class 4A state football championship. But a few years later, he was named DeKalb's principal, and in the summer of 1994, he was the one who hired me, and I've been there ever since. And while he was principal, I had the opportunity to be involved in the interview process for a particular teacher. This is a candidate that was coming from another district and had an interest in teaching math and science. The interview, for the most part, was relatively basic at first. Describe yourself, what's your educational philosophy, what does your classroom look like if I were to walk in there? Do you have any interest outside of the classroom that you might be able to help us with here at DeKalb? Things like that. But then the question about teacher licensing came up. And the candidate revealed that he did not have a valid teacher's license. You see, years ago, when teachers received their licenses, after their first year, the district who hired them was supposed to sign off on the license saying that they had successfully completed their first year of teaching. This candidate, that didn't happen with this candidate. The district that he was coming from did not sign off on the license. It was at this point I watched Mr. Hummer pause, lean back in his chair, and the questions turned towards what happened. What reasons or why did that district not sign off? And as the questions came out, Mr. Hummer took copious notes about what this candidate was saying. The interview concluded, and later that day, Mr. Hummer got on the phone, and he started contacting the references that this candidate had listed, and he also called that district trying to figure out what happened. After about a week or so of diving into the situation, Mr. Hummer offered this position to this teacher, and it was accepted. During that school year, I had a conversation with Mr. Hummer, and I said, why'd you hire this person? And his response was pretty simple. He said when he talked to all the references and talked to the other district, the people at the other district all agreed that this teacher deserved a second chance. And Mr. Hummer was willing to offer it. And that's our theme for this evening, second chances. And as I read through it this morning and later this afternoon, it is a lesson in grace. Because if we read in Romans 3:23, we are reminded that every single one of us has sinned. Every single one of us has fallen short. But this same God is gracious. The same God grants us opportunities throughout our lives to redeem ourselves. And He has done so throughout time. And if we read throughout the Bible, we read of men and women who have not followed God's instructions. And yet, their lives were spared, and some, if not many of them, are considered to be great in the eyes of many. So tonight, I want to take a brief look at some of these men and women and see what we can learn about them. So as we think about second chances, in the Old Testament, one of the first people I think of is Jonah. In Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, God himself reaches out to Jonah and instructs him specifically to go to the city of Nineveh and preach to them. Nineveh, a city full of wickedness. So immediately upon hearing this request, Jonah gets on a boat, which is a good thing. Problem is, he sails in a different direction, not headed towards Nineveh. And he thinks that God isn't going to see this happening. So while on his journey, God creates an extremely dangerous, windy, stormy environment on the sea, even to the point where the ship that he's on is going to be destroyed. And in the efforts to save themselves, the other sailors on the ship find Jonah. He's asleep in the well of the boat. And Jonah tells them that he fears the Lord and that he's trying to flee from him. Jonah, through their conversation, said they should probably just throw him into the waters and let the sea, and see what happens, see if the sea will calm. And although those sailors resisted that thought initially, that's what they did. They took Jonah and they threw him into the sea, and the winds and the storms ceased. And while he's in the sea, Jonah gets swallowed by a large fish, and he's in the belly of that fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And in that condition, Jonah takes the opportunity to pray. He prays to God, and after hearing those prayers, we are told that the Lord spoke to the fish and threw Jonah up onto dry land. So then God goes to Jonah again, a second time, and then tells him, go to Nineveh. And this time he did. And while he was there, he preached to all about their evil ways. The people heard this message. They turned away from their evil ways. God saw this and chose not to wreak disaster upon that city. That second chance that Jonah was given resulted in about 120,000 people turning away from their evil. You never know how a message might be received. Jonah, probably thinking about the wickedness in Nineveh, probably wasn't too, wasn't too hopeful of what might happen. And tonight, some of you may walk out of here saying, I have no idea what Steve was trying to tell us. Others of you might feel encouraged, and maybe others of you might be spurred enough to change. Jonah spoke to a very wicked group of people, and with the Lord's help and that second opportunity, the message was fruitful. And I think that's something that we should all feel encouraged by. How about David? David was a king of Israel, began his life as a shepherd, probably well known for his defeat of Goliath. Later on, he was anointed king, built a great palace, amassed a large amount of wealth and prestige. But then in 2 Samuel 11, we read of his great sin. The armies were away fighting, and during that time, David sees a woman bathing. He lusted after her, seduced her, even though that she was the wife of one of his commanders. She became pregnant. And David, trying to cover up the pregnancy, tried to summon her husband Uriah home, trying to give the impression that Uriah was the father instead of him. However, Uriah refused to sleep in his own bed with his wife while his men were still fighting. So the cover-up wasn't working. So again, David hatched this plan to have Uriah deliberately killed while in battle. And when he was killed, David took Bathsheba to be his wife, again, trying to hide this sin. But in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 27, we read that God saw what David had done, and it had displeased the Lord. And consider those things he had done. He had seduced another man's wife, committed adultery, tried to pass off his child onto another man, plotted the successful murder of another man. Not good stuff. That same God that was unhappy with David, though, gave him another chance. Sent the prophet Nathan to have a discussion with him in the very next chapter, chapter 12. And Nathan told David that he was going to have trouble within his own home and his own house, that his wives would be taken away, and he would lose the child that was to be born due to all his discretions. In Psalm 51, verses 1 through 4, we read of David's repentance. Psalm 51, verses 1 through 4. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only have I sinned, and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak and blameless when you judge. This brief passage, he acknowledges his sins and expresses regret. And after hearing this, Nathan responds back to David. We're back in 2 Samuel. Chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. So David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. However, because of this deed, you have given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. The child who is born to you shall surely die. Then Nathan departed to his house. You see, the Lord was going to forgive Nathan for the sin, but as a result of the sin, the child that was to be born was to die. And that's exactly what happened. God then allowed David to start a new relationship with Bathsheba, was allowed to take her as his wife, and they were able to have another child named Solomon, which comes from a word meaning peace. He should have been stripped of his throne. He should have been executed. He should have been never allowed to marry that woman due to his adultery. But yet God allowed him another opportunity to be king, to be a husband, and to be a father. And then we have Peter. Usually in every group, there's probably one person who tends to speak out more than the others. And with you think about the disciples of Jesus, it's probably Peter is the one that comes to mind. In Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 and 22, Peter asked Jesus how many times he should forgive the same person who offended him. Peter offers a generous amount of 7 times. But Jesus adds to that saying, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. With the concept being this: we should forgive this person many times. God has an unlimited amount of grace, mercy, and forgiveness, and so should we. But regarding Peter specifically, in the final hours before the crucifixion of Jesus, Peter boldly proclaims that he would always stand by Jesus' side. In Matthew 26, verses 31 through 35, we read of this account. Then Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But I have been raised, and I will go before you to Galilee. Peter answered and said to him, even if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. And Jesus said to him, assuredly, I say to you this night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And so said all the disciples. Jesus knew better. Jesus knew what was going to happen. And at the end of that very same chapter, the prediction came true. Now Peter sat outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him saying, you also were with Jesus of Galilee. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you are saying. And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth." But again he denied with an oath, "I do not know this man." And a little later, those who stood by came up and said to Peter, "Surely you also are one of them, for your speech betrays you." And then he began to curse and swear, saying, "I do not know the man." And immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the word of Jesus, who had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So he went out and wept bitterly. Again, focusing there at the end of verse 75, he went out and wept bitterly. As Peter watched the next events unfold, I can only imagine the pain and anguish that he might have felt. He said he would never deny Jesus, and here he did it, not once, not twice, but 3 times. But by the end of the Gospel of John, Peter is restored. In John chapter 21, verses 15 through 19, there's a conversation recorded here between Jesus and Peter, beginning in verse 15 of chapter 21. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Feed my lambs." And he said to him again a second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend to my sheep." And he said to him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" And Peter was grieved because he had said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish." This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, "Follow me." So if we read through that passage, 4 things that Jesus tells Peter to do: feed my lambs, tend to my sheep, feed my sheep, and then follow me. This Q&A, he's asking Peter to take care of his disciples. He's asking them to follow him, to be a disciple of Christ. And here he was given another chance. And Peter took advantage of it. As we continue to read and get into the book of Acts, he preaches one of the first known sermons, and what happens at the end of that sermon? About 3,000 people obeyed and were baptized. Just another instance of when a second chance was taken advantage of. And the fourth one is also found in the Gospel of John. This is the adulterous woman, found in John chapter 8. We read of a woman here being brought to Jesus, and she has been caught in the act of adultery. And the law laid out back in Leviticus specifically stated that the adulterer would be put to death. So let's read this passage beginning in John chapter 8, verse 1. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Moses and the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say?" This they said, testing him, that they might have something to which accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground, and those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest, even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus has raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, "Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." See, they weren't interested in the fate of this woman. They were trying to attack Jesus. If he said yes, he would have been accused of breaking the law, as a Roman governor at that time was the only one who could order an execution. And if he said no, he would be breaking that law mentioned in Leviticus. But the statement of who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first, asked them to compare themselves to her. And as they pondered those words, each one of them left, one by one, doing nothing. You see, her sin was known. She had been humiliated. She had been caught. She knew what the punishment was to be. And yet Jesus Christ himself spared her. He saved her from the mob, told her that he doesn't condemn her. He frees her and says, "Don't do this anymore." We have 4 people. 4, and I know there are others, but these are 4 who behaved and acted in a way that was contrary to what God would want them to do. And each one of them was granted a chance to redeem themselves. And instead of the punishment that awaited them, another option was presented, a chance to renew themselves. And in most of these cases, that second chance was taken advantage of. I want to go back to the story I told you at the beginning about that teacher that Mr. Hummer hired. 1995 yearbook doesn't do me much justice. The teacher that was interviewed, that I was involved in the process with, was me. My first year of teaching was not a bed of roses. It was tough. My evaluator was very harsh on me. She even told me on one occasion that she wasn't sure I was ever going to make it. At my year-end evaluation, after all my shortcomings had been shared in this large group, my representative at the time asked the question, would Mr. Ternay benefit from a second year with guided, intentional assistance? Without hesitation, her response was no. It was at that point that I realized that it was possible that I would never be in the classroom again. But Mr. Hummer gave me that second chance. He passed away in December. And over the past 29 or so years, he and I had so many conversations. So many conversations. He had battled cancer for the last 9 years of his life. And ironically, when Mom was going through her cancer treatment at Parkview a few days, he walked in with him and his wife. So we sat in the waiting room and talked and laughed and tried to lighten the moment, because you're sitting in a room for radiation treatment for cancer. It's not a fun place. But we had some good conversations. And during at least one of those times, I thanked him. I thanked him for that second chance. If you knew him, he looked at me, was very humble, and he said, "Steve, it wasn't my doing, it was yours." I'm just so grateful that I had that chance to thank him. So here's my question for each one of you, including myself. Every single one of you has been given a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, multiple chances when you've done something or behaved in a way that God would not like. And when that happens, or when that happened, what'd you do? My charge to you tonight is this: I would encourage you all to pause and thank God for the grace that He has shown each and every one of us. He could very easily punish us more, but He didn't. He doesn't. Psalm 103. Psalm 103 describes this grace that He gives us. I have in my notes verses 10 through 12. I'm going to read a little bit more of the passage. I'm going to start beginning in verse 1, Psalm 103. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquities, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from destruction, who crowns you with loving kindness and tender mercies, who satisfies your mouth with good things, so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. The Lord executes righteousness and justice for all who are oppressed. He made known his ways to Moses, his acts to the children of Israel. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in mercy. He will not always strive with us, nor will he keep his anger forever. He has not dealt with us according to our sins, nor punished us according to our iniquities. For as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is his mercy towards those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far he has removed our transgressions from us. If God were to deal with us every single time we committed a sin, he would be continually punishing us. Yet he has compassion for us. He offers grace to each and every one of us. When those situations arise, be thankful. Realize that mistakes have been made. Try to correct them and take advantage of that second chance. If you're with us tonight and you're not a Christian, you need to know that even though you haven't made that decision yet, God is still willing to give you a chance. Make those changes in your life. He's waiting to accept you. He's waiting to work with you to correct them, help you behave in a way that will lead you towards the best place ever, in heaven.